Her smirk never wavered as she zoomed in on the approaching formation, capturing every calculated movement through her camera. She barely noticed the murmurs from the surrounding tourists, who were growing visibly uncomfortable as they shifted around her. People exchanged glances, their patience thinning as Deborah continued to occupy the very path the guards were meant to march. She was convinced that they would simply go around her, just as she had seen in countless films and photos. After all, who would dare disturb her photo opportunity? As the guards drew closer, the unmistakable rhythm of their march grew louder, the ground vibrating slightly with the force of their coordinated steps. The first few tourists had already begun to step back, respecting the ceremony and the authority it represented. But Deborah, ever the picture of defiance, stood tall, oblivious to the growing discomfort in the crowd. She even took a few more steps forward, positioning herself in the direct line of the guards, her phone still held high like a weapon against the flow of tradition. The atmosphere seemed to hold its breath as the guards' footsteps grew louder, the formation now mere feet away. Deborah, however, showed no sign of yielding. She was determined to capture her perfect moment, to prove that she was in control, not them. She continued snapping photos, oblivious to the fact that the guards, with their unyielding discipline, had no intention of stopping or altering their course for her. The sound of marching boots was now so close that it seemed to reverberate through the very air around her, but still, Deborah stood her ground, convinced the guards would veer away at the last moment. But as the guards reached her, the inevitable collision between her defiance and the unyielding authority of their march became impossible to avoid. The world around her, for just a moment, seemed to freeze. She was about to learn that some things in life, like tradition and duty, do not yield to the whims of individual desire. No matter how much she thought she was in control, the precision of the guards' march was unrelenting, their rhythm unwavering as they approached Deborah, who remained planted stubbornly in their path. Guard Windsor, at the forefront of the formation, led with the poise of someone accustomed to the weight of responsibility that came with this duty. His gaze was steady, his steps measured, each one in perfect synchronization with the others. There was no hesitation, no deviation from the route that had been assigned to him. To the guards, this was not a performance or a tourist attraction, it was a solemn duty. An embodiment of centuries of tradition, and nothing, no matter how insistent or defiant, would stand in their way. Deborah, completely unaware of the gravity of the situation, was still absorbed in the viewfinder of her phone, oblivious to the soldiers marching directly toward her. Her defiant smirk remained in place, her expectation that the guards would simply maneuver around her growing with each step they took. She raised her phone higher, now more determined than ever to capture the shot, convinced the soldiers would stop or change direction at the last moment to accommodate her. But Guard Windsor had no such intention. As the guards drew within mere inches of Deborah, Windsor's gaze remained locked forward. Never faltering, his steps as precise and unwavering as they had been in practice. Without breaking stride, he executed a controlled, calculated shoulder barge, no more than a swift yet firm movement, his shoulder making contact with Deborah's side. It was a movement that had been practiced countless times in drills, designed not to hurt, but to clear the path with military precision. It was as if the world itself had momentarily shifted in its axis, as the force of Windsor's shoulder, perfectly timed, nudged Deborah out of the way. The impact was enough to send her stumbling sideways, her composure shattered in an instant. Her sunglasses flew from her face, spinning through the air, and her phone slipped from her hand, landing somewhere on the cobblestones beneath her. Deborah, disoriented and now completely out of the shot she had so desperately wanted, stumbled and fell, crashing to the ground with a jarring thud. Her designer outfit was now tainted with the dust of the courtyard, and the carefully curated world she had once inhabited seemed to unravel in that single, unrelenting moment. Guard Windsor's steps never faltered, his gaze still fixed forward, as if nothing had happened. The formation continued its march, the disciplined movement of the guards unbroken by the interruption. The solemn rhythm of their boots on the stone echoed through the air, a stark reminder that no matter how loud the protests or how strong the defiance, some forces, like the duty these soldiers carried, would not be moved. And as Deborah lay there, her hand clutching her injured wrist, the crowd around her, once silent, began to murmur. The lesson was clear: some things, like tradition and military discipline, simply do not bend for the entitled few. Deborah's vision blurred as she scrambled to her hands and knees. Her designer outfit now marred by the dirt of the courtyard. Her sunglasses were nowhere to be found, her phone lay discarded a few feet away, and the sharp pain in her hand only seemed to deepen her shock and indignation. She clutched her wrist, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. How dare they? How dare they treat her like this? As the guards continued their march, their precise steps unbroken and their gaze fixed forward, Deborah's fury reached a boiling point. She stood up, her hands still cradled against her chest, her face flushed with outrage. "You," she began, her voice shaking with indignation, "you assaulted me." Her words were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. She took a step toward the nearest guard, pointing at him with her free hand. "That man, he attacked me. He shoved me out of the way like I'm some sort of criminal." Her words echoed in the courtyard, but no one moved to comfort her, no one seemed to take her side. Instead, the tourists around her exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the spectacle, while others simply looked away, unwilling to engage. Deborah's outrage only grew as she ignored the murmurs, her mind fixated on her own perceived victimization. "Do you see what he did?" she shouted to the growing crowd. "He knocked me down, he broke my hand. I demand he be arrested. This is assault. This is abuse of power." Her voice became increasingly shrill as she continued her tirade, her chest heaving with each breath. She ignored the fact that she had been repeatedly warned, that she had refused to move from their path, and that her defiance had led directly to this moment. No, in her eyes, the guards were to blame, not her. They were the ones who had overstepped their bounds. They were the ones who had violated her space. The security officer, who had been observing the situation from a distance, approached with caution. His tone was professional, but Deborah was beyond reason. "Ma'am, the guards were performing their duty," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You were repeatedly asked to move from their path. This is a security matter." Deborah's eyes widened with outrage, her voice rising even higher. "A security matter? Don't you dare try to spin this on me," she snapped. "I'm a paying visitor. I've been treated like an animal. I've got rights. I don't care about your security matter, I want that man arrested, right now." She jabbed her finger in the direction of Guard Windsor, who, to her growing frustration, remained motionless at his post, his eyes forward and his focus unwavering. He hadn't even acknowledged her existence since the incident. The officer's expression remained neutral as he tried again to reason with her. "Ma'am, you are blocking the path of the Queen's Guard. They have the authority to remove obstacles. And this action is within their protocol." But Deborah wasn't listening anymore. She ignored the officer's words entirely, her mind too consumed with her own version of events. "This is outrageous," she spat. "I'm going to sue. I'm going to have his job. I'm going to make sure this entire place gets shut down. You'll see what happens when you treat a paying customer like this." Her voice cracked with fury as she whipped out her phone, clutching it with her injured hand, determined to document her assault and her version of the story, convinced that the world would see her as the victim. As she raged, her words became increasingly incoherent, her focus entirely on the damage to her reputation and the injustice she felt had been done to her. She continued to demand the arrest of Guard Windsor, her face contorted with anger and disbelief. She refused to acknowledge the growing chorus of murmurs from the crowd around her, many of whom had witnessed the entire exchange and knew exactly what had transpired. But Deborah was locked in her own reality, one where she was always right, and the world had simply failed to understand her. The officer's attempts to calm her were futile, as Deborah's anger seemed to intensify with each passing second. "I'm a tax-paying citizen," she shouted, her voice rising even further. "You can't treat me like this. This is unacceptable." She continued her demands, ignoring the fact that her actions, her refusal to yield, her arrogance, had precipitated the very incident she was now crying foul over. In her mind, there was no room for self-reflection. No room for acknowledging that her defiance, her refusal to move when asked, had set the stage for the collision that had occurred. Instead, she painted herself as the innocent party, the one wronged, and she would make sure that everyone else saw it that way. 2. The tension in the courtyard continued to escalate as Deborah's demands for an arrest grew louder. Her face was flushed with rage, her eyes wild with disbelief as she pointed an accusatory finger at Guard Windsor, still standing firm and immovable. As if on cue, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard, and within moments, 2 police officers arrived on the scene, their authoritative presence cutting through the chaos. The crowd seemed to draw back, some spectators shifting uncomfortably while others stood in hushed silence, all eyes on Deborah and her increasingly erratic behavior. One of the officers, a tall woman with a calm and practiced demeanor, stepped forward. She surveyed the scene, taking in Deborah's disheveled appearance, her designer clothes now dirted, and her agitated movements. The officer glanced briefly at Guard Windsor, who remained perfectly composed at his post, and then at the growing group of witnesses standing nearby. "Ma'am," the officer began, her voice measured and professional, "I understand you're upset, but the situation here is clear. You were repeatedly warned to move, and you chose not to comply with those warnings. You interfered. Why? You interfered with the performance of a military duty." Deborah's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening as she turned her furious gaze onto the officer. "I don't care about your military duties," she snapped, her voice laced with contempt. "This is a public space, and I'm a paying visitor. I have every right to stand where I want. What happened to freedom of movement? Why do these guards think they can just push people around? They should be arrested for assault." The officer sighed, clearly accustomed to dealing with situations like this, but her patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am, the Queen's Guard have a duty to perform, and that includes the authority to remove any obstacles in their path. You were given 6 warnings by both the guards and the security personnel to clear the path. Your actions are considered interference with their duties, and that is against the law." Deborah, undeterred, threw her hands up in the air, her frustration spilling over. "Interference? I was just trying to take a picture. And that man, Windsor, he shoved me. He assaulted me," she yelled, her voice rising in pitch. "I demand his arrest. I'm a tax-paying citizen. How dare you defend him?" Her words spilled out in a frantic jumble as she continued to clutch her injured hand, the pain no longer as important as her sense of injustice. The second officer, a younger man, approached the growing group of tourists who had gathered nearby. Some with their phones still raised, filming the entire scene. He spoke briefly with a few witnesses, gathering their statements. The expressions on the bystanders' faces told a different story than Deborah's. Many were shaking their heads or exchanging looks of disbelief. A few quietly muttered to each other, confirming that Deborah had been warned repeatedly and had refused to move, her defiance escalating with each attempt to reason with her. The male officer, after speaking to the witnesses, returned to Deborah. His face was neutral, but his tone was firm. "We've spoken with several witnesses, including those who were standing near you, and they've confirmed that you were given multiple warnings. The guards did not act outside of their protocol. The force they used was necessary to clear the path. You interfered with their duties, and under the Armed Forces Act, that is an offense. Deborah, still reeling from the perceived injustice of the situation, scoffed. This is ridiculous. I don't care about your laws. I'm a paying customer. I deserve respect. She was spiraling now, her mind unable or unwilling to process the reality that she had caused this situation. In her world, money and status should have protected her from such things. After all, wasn't that what they taught her? That as a privileged individual, she could bend the world to her will. The female officer shook her head, her voice now tinged with the slightest edge of finality. Your actions were illegal, ma'am. Interfering with military personnel in the performance of their duties is a criminal offense. You can file a formal complaint through the appropriate channels, but we will not be arresting Guard Windsor. He acted within his rights. Deborah's face twisted with disbelief. I will sue. I'll have my lawyers handle this, she screamed, her voice shrill. I'll have the media here. Everyone will know how I was treated by these thugs. You'll see. This isn't over. She continued to rant, her words growing more incoherent as her sense of entitlement collided with the harsh reality of the situation. The officer remained calm, unfazed by Deborah's outburst. Ma'am, if you continue to refuse to cooperate, we will have no choice but to take further action. You are obstructing the peace and interfering with an ongoing investigation. I recommend you stop now and follow us so we can process this incident properly. Deborah's eyes darted from the officer to the crowd, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. She had never been in a situation like this before. Her world, her carefully curated existence, had never been challenged in such a way. You can't do this. She cried, her voice breaking with frustration. I'm a victim here. You can't just ignore what happened. The officers exchanged a brief look, their decision already made. We can and we will, ma'am, the male officer said, his voice final. If you refuse to cooperate, you will be taken to the station to file your statement. Otherwise, we will have no choice but to arrest you for disturbing the peace. Deborah stood frozen for a moment. Her mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. Finally, realizing there was no way out of this, she reluctantly nodded, though the fire of defiance still burned in her eyes. The officers, with practiced professionalism, guided her away from the scene, leaving the guards and the witnesses to resume the ceremony. As the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves, the lesson of the day became clear. Some forces, whether they were tradition, military protocol, or simply the law, could not be bent to the will of a single individual, no matter how entitled, no matter how rich or powerful they believed themselves to be. The situation had reached its inevitable conclusion. As the last echoes of Deborah's protests faded into the distance, Captain Roberts, a seasoned military officer with a commanding presence, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene with the practiced calm of someone who had seen such incidents unfold before. His uniform gleamed in the sunlight, the polished brass of his insignia reflecting the light as he surveyed the disarray left behind by Deborah's outburst. Ma'am, Captain Roberts began, his voice steady but authoritative, I've been briefed on the situation. He turned to the crowd, his eyes briefly meeting theirs, as if he were speaking not just to Deborah but to everyone present. The Queen's Guard are active-duty military personnel. They have a responsibility to perform their duties, and their actions are always within the framework of protocol. Interfering with that duty is a criminal offense under Section 28 of the Armed Forces Act, which is exactly what has occurred here today. Deborah's face was still flushed with outrage, her eyes darting around, looking for any shred of support from the people around her, but she found none. The crowd, which had initially been swept up in her drama, had gradually grown silent, their focus shifting to the captain as his words sank in. The lesson had already begun to take hold in the minds of the witnesses, and as the captain spoke, it became clear that this was about more than just an entitled tourist clashing with a soldier. It was about respect for something far larger than individual desires. Captain Roberts continued, his tone unwavering. What you saw here today was not a trivial ceremony or a tourist spectacle. It was a living tradition, one that has stood for centuries. The guards you see before you are not playing dress-up, and their duties are not optional. They represent something greater than any one person. And today, some lessons were learned in ways that are unfortunately necessary. Deborah, still seething with frustration, tried to interrupt, but the captain raised a hand, cutting her off with the quiet authority that only years of service could earn. Your actions today, ma'am, have shown a profound disrespect for that tradition. But let me make one thing clear, this is not a matter of personal feelings. The law is the law, and the Queen's Guard have the full right to clear any obstruction from their path. Your refusal to yield, your blatant disregard for their duty, has led to this moment. At that, Deborah's eyes widened in disbelief. She had expected to be coddled, to be seen as the victim in this scenario. But instead, she was being told, in no uncertain terms, that the world did not revolve around her personal agenda. The reality she had built in her mind, where status, money, and power afforded her the right to bypass the rules, was quickly crumbling in the face of an unyielding force of tradition and law. As the officers moved to escort her away for questioning, the crowd began to murmur amongst themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others exchanged knowing glances. But all had witnessed something profound, the clash between civilian entitlement and military discipline, a collision that would resonate far beyond this moment. Deborah, still furious and unable to fully grasp the lesson being imparted to her, was led away by the police officers. Her protests faded as she was guided out of the scene, her voice growing softer, though still filled with indignation. But it was clear to everyone present that she was learning something she had never expected. Some forces, like tradition and duty, could not be manipulated or ignored, no matter how much money, status, or entitlement one had. As the guards resumed their duties, continuing their perfect, synchronized march, the crowd began to disperse, but the lesson lingered. It was a lesson about respect for tradition, about understanding that there were certain roles and responsibilities that transcended individual wants. The Queen's Guard was not there for show, they were soldiers, serving with discipline and honor, representing a time-honored tradition that demanded respect, and for Deborah, as she was led away, the lesson would be a hard one to forget. Respect for duty and tradition was not a luxury to be discarded when it became inconvenient. It was a principle that endured, standing firm in the face of any challenge, and in this case, it was Deborah who would walk away with a lesson learned, not in a courtroom, but in the humbling shadow of a centuries-old military tradition. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.